Street photography and fashion photography might be two of the most opposed photographic genres.
Round 1, fight!
A street photographer looks for candid images, whereas a fashion photographer intricately stages the scene. A street photographer usually captures ordinary people, whereas a fashion photographer will most likely only shoot professional models. A street photographer usually acts as a lone wolf, whereas a fashion photographer shares the stage with a creative director, a stylist, a set designer, an assistant, and probably more people that I can't think of right now. And perhaps the most striking difference is that the street photographer shoots with no clear goal in mind, often letting a mix of their intentions and the randomness of the situation they encounter influence their willingness to press the shutter. On the other hand, the fashion photographer has a clear goal in mind, making an image that highlights the products from the brand that hired them. Ironically, despite all those differences, fashion photography and street photography are almost interlinked since their inception. To understand how these two worlds first collided, we have to go back almost 100 years ago, in 1909. It is at this time that two brothers, the Seebelgers, would, for the first time in the history of photography, produce work at the intersection of fashion and street photography. They did it by taking their heavy plate cameras to racetracks and beach resorts to document what the elite of that time were actually wearing. They called it instantané de haute mode, snapshots of high fashion. This was the first time the street was used to validate style. After the Seebelgers took the fashion world outdoors, the genre entered into a golden age of sophistication, in which some of the most iconic fashion photographers emerged. We can, for example, think of George Hoyningen-Huene, who brought the serenity of classic Greek sculpture to the page, creating an elusive and remote feminine ideal. Or Cecil Beaton, a master of the theatrical. He was renowned for his unique style of posing sitters against elaborate and unusual backgrounds. We can also think of Horst P. Horst, who became the synonym for style and elegance, famously using dramatic lighting and props to create monumental images of women. Or one of my favorites, Erwin Blumenfeld, a pioneer of the avant-garde who was using darkroom experimentations, mirrors, and light to turn the fashion object into a work of art. One of the most renowned fashion photographers from that era, Irving Penn, redefined the post-war era with a streamlined, minimalist aesthetic, using simple backgrounds to emphasize the abstract interplay of line and volume. Or Richard Avedon, himself the master of capturing a person's essence, blurring the lines between advertising and fine art portraiture. All these photographers weren't just taking pictures. They turned fashion photography into a highly regarded art form, to the point that by the mid-1950s, fashion photography had reached a peak of perfection. But this came with a cost. It became completely disconnected from the dirt and noise of real life. This was about to change drastically when in 1954, Vogue hired a man that was about to transform fashion photography forever. And his name might be familiar to you, William Klein. Klein was obsessed with the friction of the sidewalk, and this showed in his images. He sometimes used a wide-angle lens, which was unusual in fashion at the time, and placed the model in different situations. For example, in the middle of a wrestling game or next to Marines. At other times, he would use a telephoto lens and would capture the models evolving through the crowd. He did not try to clear the streets and was more than happy if some random pedestrian would walk in the frame. As in his street photography, he also embraced motion blur and high grain. Although reinvigorating fashion photography by injecting more real life into it, William Klein did not really take it that seriously. He mostly used fashion photography to earn money to finance his personal projects, such as his infamous book, Life is Good and Good for You in New York. He even ended up gently mocking fashion photography by releasing the movie Who Are You, Polly McGoo in 1966.
Polly vient de derrière le miroir. Elle ignore la pesanteur. Elle court sans s'essouffler. Elle est sidérale.
L'équipe.
Et vous n'aimez pas son look? Non, je n'aime pas son look. Écoutez-moi, les sœurs Carita. Nous sommes prêts à aller dans la lune et vous me faites des boucles à la Marie-Antoinette. Ce n'est pas possible. Et son maquillage? Je veux un visage lisse et dur et lumineux comme l'aluminium. Je veux que ses yeux fassent bip, bip. Vous comprenez? Oui, madame. Regardez-la. C'est une fusée. Et ici, c'est la tête chercheuse. Et elle cherche. Bip, bip. Vous avez compris. Faites-moi une coiffure pour une fusée. Carita, nous allons dans la lune. Bien, madame, qu'elle vienne au salon. Qu'elle vienne au salon. Au revoir, fusée. Bip, bip.
Klein was not the only street photographer taking on fashion photography assignments to make a living in New York. Another legendary street photographer was also participating to bring the models to the streets at that time. And his name might be even more familiar than William Klein. Saul Leiter was also shooting fashion at that time and also participated in bringing the models to the street. Leiter was a pioneer of color street photography at a time when Segal's work was almost always black and white. But unlike Klein, who wanted to confront the city, Leiter wanted to filter it. He treated the New York streets like an abstract painting, a wash of soft colors, deep shadows, and mystery. While Klein was using the crowds to make the model look like it is a part of something bigger, Leiter managed to create a feeling of intimacy, while still making it clear that the image was taken in the busy streets of New York. Leiter proved that the streets didn't just offer grit, it also offered poetry. By using reflection and blur, he made fashion feel like a fleeting, secret moment rather than the ad of a commercial product. With Klein and Leiter, the studio walls had finally come down. The street was no longer just a background, it was a character. And this set the stage for the next generation of fashion photographers who would eventually turn the sidewalk into the most important runway in the world. One of those photographers is Frank Horvath, who was introduced to fashion photography after William Klein noticed his excellent street and photojournalistic work. Frank Horvath created some iconic images, such as these ones. It is quite clear that his street photographer eye helped him craft good fashion images. Another person that I think really acted as a link between the pioneers we just evoked and more contemporary street photographers doing fashion work is Guy Bourdin. He learned photography by doing street photographs and quickly shifted to fashion photography. But it seems like fashion photography was just an excuse for him to stage some incredible surrealist street photographs. The colors, the scenes he imagined, the composition, everything was so modern, so perfect. I could talk for much longer about Guy Bourdin's work that I think is phenomenal, and I actually already did so in another video on my channel. The link is in the description. And by the way, don't forget to like this video and maybe share it with a friend if you are enjoying it. Thanks a lot in advance for your support. I think we now have looked enough at the past. The present seems really exciting. I might be wrong, but I have the impression that there are more and more street photographers being hired to shoot fashion campaigns. We can, for example, think of Bruce Gilden and his work for Gucci in 2020. Simple portraits, with his characteristic flash and models that share some similarities with the characters Gilden usually goes for when shooting street portraits. Bruce also worked for Diesel, Dolce & Gabbana, Balenciaga, or Kenzo, among other brands, always using different facets of his style in those series. It is quite obvious why Bruce Gilden is one of the street photographers doing a lot of fashion work. as his street photography is often focusing on characters that stand out by their facial features or by their fashion style. Another legendary street photographer that was hired for numerous fashion campaigns is Martin Parr. He insisted that fashion was an excellent way to bring an income that documentary photography didn't provide, while at the same time being another creative outlet, especially when shooting editorials, which Martin Parr did a lot. We can see that in most of those, his style is very recognizable. There is no doubt as to who is behind those images. The kitsch aspect, the sometimes self-depreciating and ironic tone of those images is very similar to the images Martin did in his street and documentary work. Parr himself said that fashion brands are hiring him because he is Martin Parr and they are expecting Martin Parr imagery. Another great street photographer that does a lot of fashion shoots recently is Daniel Arnold. What I really like in Arnold's editorial work is the way he manages to make the images look exactly like one of his street photographs would look like. There is always a certain strangeness in them, a certain oddity, and I think it's not easy to make a stage image look like a candid one. In street photography, you don't control much. The scenes are offering themselves to you, whereas in fashion, you have to create almost everything from scratch. Arnold is really good at making this translation between street and fashion work in a flawless manner. We can feel some inspiration from William Klein in some of the images' grittiness and in the willingness to include passerbys, or some of Bourdain's influence, for example, in this image. In all those examples I mentioned throughout this video, I like the fashion photographs as much as I like the street photographs produced by those photographers. But there is one photographer from whom I like the personal work a lot, but did not really adhere to his fashion photographs. Harry Grier. He worked for Hermès, and I can't find his unique photographic style in those fashion images. I'm sure there was something better to do without needing to reinvent his distinctive style based on strong colors and a certain exoticism. I understand that a fashion photography assignment was probably a way for him to experiment with new techniques such as double exposures, but I'm personally not a big fan of the result. There is actually a fashion photographer named Vincent van de Wijngaard that did fashion photographs that look more like what I would have expected from Harry Grier. For documentary and street photographers, fashion photography can be a very good way to monetize your skills. In order to do so, a very distinctive style is needed, as we saw it in our examples. Klein's gritty black and white, Gilden's flash, Martin Parr's kitsch, or Daniel Arnold's strangeness. All those photographers have a unique style when shooting street photography. And it is thanks to this uniqueness that fashion brands have an interest in hiring them. Thanks a lot for watching this video, and don't hesitate to leave a comment. You can, for example, mention a street photographer that does fashion work that I didn't mention in this video. There must be plenty of them. If you have enjoyed the video, don't hesitate to leave a like, to subscribe, and yeah, I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye!